So, about a year into the fighting of the war, a war that was not going as Lincoln had wanted it to, again, as he saw at Battle of Bull Run, as he saw in the 7 Days Battle, he couldn't finish this war as quickly as he thought and as everybody thought in the North it would be. So Lincoln realized, you know what? I have to make a drastic move. I have to make this about slavery. But his cabinet is like, oh, I don't know if you want to do that yet, Abe. Particularly his Secretary of State, William H. Seward, who's like, listen, you need a victory. If you do this from a position of military weakness, it's going to look like an act of desperation. And no country is going to want to ever come in on the side of a desperate, weak country. It needs to be on the side of this, country in this case, even though it didn't acknowledge that the South as a country, is winning. So Lincoln's like, I got to get a victory, but my guy's not giving me anything. But throughout 61, throughout 62, slaves are escaping from Southern plantations and going to Union camps as Union soldiers are throughout the South. And this question is like, what legally do we do with them? Are they contraband of war? Can we keep them? Do we have to send them back? Can we use them as soldiers? Can we use them as labor? And so Lincoln is being pushed in many cases by the slaves themselves to come to a decision. And so he's like, this is going to help us win the war. And the goal is to win the war and to preserve the Union. Since that is my stated goal, is to keep the Union together, I will now make it about slavery. I didn't want to make it about slavery before. I didn't want to offend those border states, but I've got an ultimate goal, and that's to win the war. So I'll make it about slavery. So the Battle of Antietam, also known as Sharpsburg, is that battle that is so crucial. Now, it's also really important to understand that Robert E. Lee never leaves the South except for two times. And one of the times he just barely crosses into the North in Maryland, from Virginia into Maryland. And his goal is basically to say, listen, we can come into the North and we can win. Hey, Northerners, maybe you want to end this war because we're so powerful. And hey, maybe some of you border states want to come join us. Okay. So he crosses into the North. Believe it or not, McClellan actually finds out the Southern battle strategy. Actually, there's a Northern soldier who finds them wrapped around some cigars and delivers the strategy to McClellan. And even then, McClellan can't have like a real dominating victory. Like, we're talking 23,000 die just in one day. This is incredibly brutal. Now, I'm showing you these images not because I want to revel in death, but I just want to show you something very, very interesting about this war. This is the first war that we have photographs from. A very famous wartime photographer named Matthew Brady. And so he would actually go out, and he and fellow photographers would go out and they would photograph the carnage. They wouldn't necessarily photograph people as they were fighting because they couldn't do that. They had photography took so long to do. They could only sort of do it if you were still. And of course, these dead bodies are quite still. But they also were a little bit disingenuous. They would be like, hey, can you move that body here? Can you move that body there? It's going to look better, quote unquote, if we have a whole bunch of dead bodies piled up. So you got to sort of take it all with a grain of salt that this was actually sort of manufactured. The dead bodies are very real, but they might be sort of placed in certain ways to make them look more macabre or more dramatic. Now, Lincoln had told McClellan, like, you've got to destroy the rebel army. And in the end, like, the South takes off, after they're sort of pushed back across, and McClellan doesn't follow them. And so Lincoln's like, are you kidding me? Like, you had their battle strategy. You couldn't handily defeat them. You allowed them to retreat. This war is going to continue longer and longer and longer. So McClellan is actually relieved of his command. He was actually relieved of his command twice. And interestingly, he's going to run against Lincoln in 1864 for president. But Lincoln at least had enough of a victory that he could give the Emancipation Proclamation. So it wasn't a great, great victory, but it was enough of a victory so that he could actually come from a position of relative strength. Now, Lincoln issues this proclamation. It is not a law passed by Congress. It is what is known as an executive order. So Lincoln, in his capacity as commander-in-chief of the military, says all southern states. Okay. And again, that's weird because to him, he's saying southern states as if they're still part of the United States. They all consider themselves part of another country. But he's like, you need to lay down your arms by the 1st of January of the next year, 1863. Okay. Or all the slaves are going to be freed by me, the president and the commander in chief of the military. Okay. Now, are they going to do it? No, they're not. Does Lincoln hope that some might? Yeah, he does. But realistically, what he's basically banking on is that on the 1st of January, 1863, he's going to have to formalize it and it's going to be legit. And it does. No states come back. And so on the 1st of January, he says, all slaves in southern states are free. Now, it's really important to understand what the EP does and doesn't do. It proclaimed all slaves in the Confederate territories to be forever free. Yet, Lincoln doesn't really have any control over the South. He may say he does legally, but Jefferson Davis is like, yo, I'm president of the South. I don't know who you're talking to. Now, it's important to recognize that only about 50,000 slaves are freed because the Union Army is in position in the South where there's about 50,000 slaves that they have control over. The rest are only going to be freed sort of as the North takes over parts of the South. But it makes the destruction of slavery an explicit war goal. And that was something that Lincoln wasn't willing to say in his inaugural address way back in March 1861. He wasn't willing to say it throughout 1861. He wasn't willing to say it throughout the first part of 1862. But now he's going to say it is. This is about slavery. And that has important diplomatic effects in terms of sort of keeping Britain and France out of the war, or at least out of the war on the side of the South. The EP does not compensate any owners, which was always something that had been talked about, giving money to people to give up their slaves. It didn't outlaw slavery. So it didn't actually create anything that said slavery is not legal. It just said, I'm going to free your slaves. And it didn't make any of these freedmen citizens. So these are important parts that are going to have to be resolved later on after the war is over. The 13th Amendment, which is going to be passed in early 1865 and ratified in late 1865, that ultimately makes slavery illegal. So in some ways, the emancipation is sort of like the pre-13th Amendment, okay? Now, even though Lincoln, at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, on 1/1/1863, only technically freed 50,000 slaves, didn't free any slaves in the border states that he actually had control over. Yes, you heard that right. So Lincoln could have freed slaves in the border states that were in the North, but he didn't want to do it because he didn't want to lose them, okay? And he, quote unquote, freed all the slaves in areas that he didn't have control over, but it still has major impact because it makes abolition a central goal of the war, okay? Now, it's not just about preserving the Union, it's about getting rid of slavery. He's going to outrage Southerners who envision a race war. So now that it's out on the table that this is about race, he's sort of further emboldened them. So whereas before they're like, it's about race. And he's like, it's not about race. So they're like, it's about race. And he's like, no, it's not about race. Now it's clearly about race. And so they're going to fight even further. Okay. Or I should say, they're even more committed for the South winning. It's going to be divisive in the North because, again, there are people in the North that don't want this to be about slavery. It's going to energize anti-slavery forces. So even creating even more division between people that are trying to abolish slavery from the North, sort of, the spirit of the William Lloyd Garrisons versus the people that are in the North but are actually that are more pro-slavery. And then it's going to weaken that sort of chance that Britain and France would ever come in on the side of the Confederacy, which they had been banking on. So even though Lincoln freed no slaves where he could and tried to free slaves where he couldn't, quote unquote, it still had a tremendous impact in terms of the politics, in terms of the social element. Now, again, I'm going to talk quickly about two other battles. We talked sort of first about Sumter, which is not really a battle, but then we talked about Bull Run. Then we talked about Antietam. We need to talk about two battles that basically are going on at exactly the same time that both end in Berg, Gettysburg and Vicksburg. So I told you that Robert E. Lee only goes into the North two times, one at Antietam, where he lost enough for Lincoln to give the Emancipation Proclamation. And then about a year later, he's going to go into Pennsylvania. So we saw him go into Maryland for Antietam. Now he's going to, go into Pennsylvania, which seems like it's really far north if you think about it, but it's really not that far from Virginia as long as you're passing through West Virginia, which was actually created during the war, broke away from Virginia. And he goes and he's going to fight at Gettysburg. This is the furthest north that the Southern Army, the Confederates, are ever going to get, and they lose. And so it's important to know that in the two times they went north, they lose. And this becomes sort of symbolic because it's sort of like, well, you tried, you lost, you couldn't go into the north and win. You're probably not going to win this war overall. Although, still 2 more years before that war is over. The second victory is really, really important in terms of the South. And this is a battle at Vicksburg. And sort of once the Union Army wins at Vicksburg, it's still going to be 2 more years, but it's really going to start controlling the South. And again, I showed you that Anaconda Plan where the snake's head is going to go up the Mississippi and then sort of bisect the South and sort of divide it. And, once you've divided it, it's easier to conquer it. And it sort of famously got so bad at Vicksburg in terms of like the Southern Army being sort of hemmed in, that they didn't have any food, that they were selling rats for $1 to eat. So if you actually can see Vicksburg, we're going to start right there sort of on the Mississippi, and then you're going to work your way to the coast. Okay. And we're going to see that. And so Williams Tecumseh Sherman, who I showed you that fighting ginger who was trolling the South early on, saying, you got nothing, you're wrong. And now it's 1864 and sort of he was wrong. Now he's got to get involved in sort of laying waste to the South in a war that he thought would be over so fast. And Sherman had this mentality called total war, which is basically like, you know what? I am going to make this so hard for you that I am going to mess with you psychologically. And his whole idea is that he's going to basically make it hard for people that are fighting the war because they have to worry about what's happening to their families back at home. He's just going to destroy everything. He's going to destroy homes. He's going to destroy farms. He's going to destroy railroad tracks. And in many ways, the point was, I've got to distract people that are out there fighting because they're worried about what's going on at home. And you know what? If that's what it takes to win the war, that's total war. Okay. Of course, his ginger beard, which you may or may not believe. Okay. So we go from Vicksburg in mid 63. Now we're going to be, by 64, we're going to be in Atlanta. And Atlanta is a major city in the South. The South doesn't have many major cities. It's got New Orleans, Atlanta, and really Charleston. And so what you're going to see here is what is known as Sherman's March to the Sea. So he burns Atlanta. Atlanta is burned to the ground. And then he's going to live off the land. They are going to basically take resources from families throughout the South and basically say, you know what's yours is now ours. And so he gets to Savannah in a crucial time in 1864. And then he, quote, turns left. If you're looking, his forces come and then they go to their left. They go north into what he called that hellhole of secession, South Carolina, where they are going to try to lay waste to South Carolina as well. Again, the state that started it all, Sister Caroline, way back in 1860. So in many ways, this is very, very crucial. This was what the Anaconda Plan had predicted way back in early 1861, but it takes until late 1864, 1865 for that finally to happen. Now, at the same time this is happening, really, really important, the burning of Atlanta, the destroying of any Southern railroad, you've got the election of 1864 happening. So actually between the burning of Atlanta and getting to Savannah, getting to the coast, you have an election. And we sort of forget, like, oh, yeah, there's still politics going on. So Lincoln's going to drop Hannibal Hamlin from Maine, sort of that whole, Abraham Lincoln. Remember that funny pun that I made? Oh, it was so great. And he brings in Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is a Southerner. He is from Tennessee, but he stayed with the North even as Tennessee seceded. And believe it or not, they're actually known as the Union Party, because they're trying to show that Republicans and war Democrats, Democrats that are for war as opposed to the peace Democrats with the Copperheads, that they could come together. And then George McClellan, the guy that had been Lincoln's, general at first, and then he fired him, and they brought him back, and then he fired him. Well, he's going to run as a Democrat. And you would think, oh, he's Abraham Lincoln. It's going to be an easy victory. But it's actually not, okay? Because in 1864, when Lincoln is running for reelection, no one had won a second term since Jackson back in 1832. So everybody after him had either died in office, okay, or they'd run for, president once, like James K. Polk, and then decided not to run again, or they'd run again and not been reelected. And people look at Lincoln and they're like, you were supposed to win this war. All right. The fact is that it's late 1864 and this war is not over. Plus, you've got these generals that seemingly, prior to Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, couldn't do anything. On top of that, the summer of 64 was really brutal in terms of losses of Union soldiers. You've got the Emancipation Proclamation, which had gone into effect at the beginning of the previous year, 1863, which had pissed off a bunch of racist Northerners. And at the same time, you've got the people that want slavery to be done. The radical Republicans are like, you haven't done enough to sort of end slavery. Yeah, you've got the Emancipation Proclamation, but you haven't done enough. So there's all these forces that are making it so that, like, McClellan, could he win? So I love this political cartoon for a couple reasons. One is because it's Lincoln on a horse, which just looks weird. And you've got McClellan on a horse in the background there in the bushes. But Lincoln says, don't change horses midstream. And what he's basically saying is, why in the middle of a war would you ever do this? And I bring this up because FDR is going to bring this up as well in 1944 when he is running, for his fourth time. So interesting that we're going to see these slogans sort of come back up. Okay. Now, Lincoln, like this phoenix, okay, that sort of rises from the dead. There's going to be a number of really important military victories that aid him in late 1864. Plus, he basically gives furlough to every Union soldier to go vote. And remember, there's, more people in the North. So, and again, you've got to remember that no one in the South is actually participating in this election, okay, because, they're their own country, so they say. So Lincoln is only, running in the northern states, and he beats McClellan. Okay, now it's just important to know, and I want to bring this up because I brought this up at the beginning of the previous lecture, was just showing that graph of how many more men the North had. And so there's a famous limerick that says, there once were two cats of Kilkenny, each thought there was one cat too many. So they fought and they fit and they scratched and they bit, till accepting their nails and the tip of their tails, instead of two cats, there weren't any. So here you have Ulysses S. Grant, who has become the head of the Union Army, really as it's become successful from Vicksburg on. And he goes, well, what if it comes to a Kilkenny fight? I guess our cat has the longest tail. So what he's saying here is, if the two cats kill each other, we'll still have our tail and we'll still have more people. And that's in fact what Grant is going to do at the end. He just does some math, and it's brutal math. It's deathly math, because he's like, we have more people, and if we trade one for one, we still come out with more. And so he's going to trade Union soldiers' deaths for Confederate soldiers' deaths in very brutal sort of trench-based fighting. So we think of World War I as where we see the trench warfare, but actually we see it first here in the Civil War. So finally in 1864, you've got the fighting in the South. Sherman is burning everything down. You've got Grant sort of quote unquote in the North, working his way towards Appomattox, where the war is ultimately going to be over. But as the fighting is happening, Lincoln is reelected, and he's going to give his famous second inaugural address. So in his first inaugural address, remember, he said secession isn't even legal. Slavery, we're not going to go after it in the states that it's in. Of course, that changes up by virtue of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so now he's going to talk very explicitly about slavery. And he basically says, Listen, I didn't say it, but we all know that slavery was the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents, okay, those rebels, those Southerners, would rend the Union, would tear apart our Union even by war. Okay. And so he also says neither party expected for the war the magnitude, the duration which is attained. And he's saying, like, when I stood here in 1861, no war had started, but we could sort of see it on the horizon. And now we're 4 years in. And he says, he brings in God. And he says, maybe we're being punished for having allowed this. All of this blood that has been shed, was it because we supported slavery? And he finishes with his famous last stanza: with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So he says, we got to come together. In some ways, it's like that song I played for you, or I gave to you way back last semester, Brother Jonathan's Lament for Sister Caroline. That, you know what, we do need to come back together. We need to forgive, and we need to be a country once again. So in some ways, he's like, yeah, South, you brought it all on, you insurgent rebels with your slavery, but we're going to come back together. Now, pretty soon after Lincoln gives this inaugural address, the war is over. So it's interesting. After he gave his first inaugural address, the war starts. After he gives his second inaugural address, the war ends. 3 years after the Union Army had tried to capture, to go 100 miles in those 7-day battles, it finally captures Richmond, and it destroys Richmond. And then very soon after, you have the surrender at Appomattox, okay? Appomattox Courthouse. And Ulysses S. Grant says, the war is over. The rebels are our country. And again, sort of along that reconciled spirit that Lincoln had. Now, the South has a different view. Their basic belief is the war is not over. You may have forced us into surrender, but this war is not over. And we want to keep that in mind as we look at Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. And then the Jim Crow era, which will run from 1877 all the way to the Civil Rights era in the 1950s and 1960s. Now, if you look here, okay, Lee surrenders on August 9th. Okay, that is not true at all. It should be April 9th. I'm sorry. And then within a week, less than a week, Abraham Lincoln is killed by famous actor John Wilkes Booth. I don't really know how to compare him to like what sort of movie actor you might have here in 2020, but he is a Southerner. He is incredibly angry at the end of the war, so he kills Lincoln. And this is a famous image, death of President Lincoln, as his cabinet members come in, and he's got Mary Todd Lincoln and other family members that are there. This is Lincoln in death, so he's not actually still alive here. And it says the nation's martyr. So this man died to keep the country together. Now, if we were in class, all of us, in person, you would see that on my wall, I have the rankings of the presidents, not done by me. It's actually done by C-SPAN. It's done by presidential historians. And Lincoln is number one. And you say, well, the guy couldn't get the war won for so long. How is he number one? It's the fact that when this country came apart, he was the one that was able to bring it together. But also, in hindsight, Lincoln is number one because the people at the bottom were the people that were right around him. Okay. And so what you have here is Lincoln is going to be succeeded by Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is considered the second worst president of all time. Lincoln was preceded by James Buchanan, who is considered the worst president of all time. Franklin Pierce is the third worst president of all time. He was 2 before Lincoln. So if you look at the 2 people before Lincoln and the 1 person after Lincoln, they're considered the worst of all time. Unfortunately, Chester A. Arthur, the patron saint of fan-stem economists, is also in the bottom 10. But Lincoln, not just in his height, but he towers above all other presidents that were immediately preceding or succeeding him. And so you just sort of see that stark contrast of what Lincoln meant to this country. All right. So there were our two first lectures that we're doing at home. Hopefully, it wasn't too painful.